quickly share my screen. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on carbon pricing. Today, we're going to talk about carbon pricing, but not just carbon pricing. We're going to talk about how you can turn financial risk of CO2 emissions into smarter business cases for sustainability. Today, I am joined here with Laurent Moyersoen, who is the co-founder and chief commercial officer of ClimateCamp. And myself, I am Maarten de Kroos, the marketing lead for ClimateCamp. Now, today, we're going to focus on a couple of things. First, what is carbon pricing? We can't give a webinar on carbon pricing without delving into the definition, the different types, and the carbon price we are most familiar with, the external carbon price. And then we'll move on to calculating internal carbon pricing. We'll talk about why you should set an internal carbon price. I'll give some examples of current internal carbon prices set by companies, as well as how to implement carbon pricing at your organization. You can also use carbon pricing to improve different decisions from investments to supplier tendering, for example. And Laurent will delve into some examples as well as give a specific case of how you can apply it at your company. Small practical note, everybody is muted and everybody's muted and the cameras are off. If you have questions, please paste them in the chat, or if you have questions, we also have the Q&A section on top. At the end of the presentation, at the end of the webinar, we will answer any and all questions you might have on internal carbon pricing. So let's get started. Now, what is carbon pricing? It's straightforward. There are many different definitions, but a carbon pricing is a cost or a hypothetical monetary value applied to greenhouse gas emissions. We typically take carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent, seeing as we use this to group greenhouse gas emissions, and we will use a carbon price to incentivize emissions reduction. Why? By making it more expensive to emit carbon by putting a price on it. Carbon pricing will encourage businesses and individuals to reduce their emissions through cleaner technologies, energy efficiency, or other methods. Now, there are different types of carbon prices. There are two main types, which are the external carbon price, which is set by governments or regulatory bodies on a national or supranational level. These are the carbon prices we are most familiar with. Then we have internal carbon price, which is set voluntarily by companies to guide internal decisions. And the external carbon price, we have two main subdivisions: carbon taxes, which are levied at a fixed price per ton of CO2 emitted and are applied to certain sectors or at certain intervals. We also have the emission trading system, which is very well known, I think, for people in the here in the call who are in Europe. Emission trading system, or the EU ETS, for example, is a very well-known system for carbon pricing, where there is a market for buying and selling allowances in a capped market, which means there is a certain amount of CO2 emissions which can be generated in a market, and it has a fixed cost associated with it. These allowances are then bought and shared between companies. So if you have a surplus of emissions reduction, so you reduced more emissions than you were planning to or you were allowed to, you can then sell these allowances to other players in the markets. The emission trading system will also reduce allowances over time. So this means, and the EU ETS example, there is a max amount of allowances you can buy now across Europe, and that will go down over time. And we know if there are less shares, for example, the price will go up. We have EU ETS now. There will also be EU ETS 2, which will be launched in 2027, I think. And for carbon taxes, a good example in Europe as well is CBAM, or the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which will start in 2027 as well. Why is external prices or external carbon prices important for internal carbon pricing? Because internal carbon pricing takes a lot of price signals and then tries to determine what a good price would be for your organization. The ETS is one of the most significant ones. So a lot of companies who want to start using internal carbon pricing start with the price for EU ETS now. Then we have internal carbon pricing. As I said before, it is set voluntarily by companies to guide internal decisions. It will help with investment decisions. It will help with procurement, helping them select suppliers who are more sustainable. Now you have different types in internal carbon pricing. And the types differ in how the price or the tax is applied within the organization. You have a shadow price, which is just a hypothetical cost. So no funds are transferred, no fee is paid. It's just we put a hypothetical price, let's say 100 euros per ton of CO2 emissions, and we use that to estimate project costs, for example, to think about mergers and acquisitions if we want to purchase new businesses, and then use this cost to see what the projected cost might be, as well as CapEx evaluations. Now, the second one is an implicit price, but I've placed it between brackets here because it's the effective cost of current or planned decarbonization measures. But the problem with implicit price is it's very specific, and it often relates to scope 1 and scope 2 investments, as well as if you are a fuel company or if you are an energy company. Because if you would, for example, lay solar panels on your business, the cost of that project and the emissions it reduces over time may differ a lot depending on which site you are laying solar panels on, the price of solar panels in that specific country. So implicit price is a price signal which is used for the different to build up your internal carbon prices, but it is not used one-on-one because it has a lot of variation for region, for type of project, for example. An investment in solar panels might have a vastly different cost associated with it than working together with your suppliers or investing in sustainable transport, for example. The third one we have is an internal carbon fee. Now, an internal carbon fee is not hypothetical. There is an actual charge applied to internal business units. So what does this mean? A certain business unit can get charged a certain amount because they emitted this amount of tons of CO2 emissions, and then these funds are pooled. And then these funds are either used across the organization to improve certain business units or to improve certain processes, when it comes to CO2 emissions, or it can be earmarked, so it can be only used within the business unit where the funds were generated. Shadow price and internal carbon fee are two sides of a spectrum. Shadow price is when you are just dipping your toe into internal carbon pricing. It helps set a direction, but you don't have to pay fees yet. Internal carbon fee is already much more advanced, much more complex to initialize. Now, if you look at external carbon prices, the World Bank did some estimations on what a carbon price should be like if we want to limit temperatures up to 1.5 degrees Celsius and to 2 degrees Celsius. As you can see here you have a list of different carbon taxes and ETS systems across the world. And as you can see, if we want to retain temperature under 1.5 degrees Celsius, we always need to have a carbon price of 226 up to 385 tons per CO2 equivalent. As you can see, not one carbon tax or ETS even comes close to this price level. But they also calculated what it would take to keep it below 2 degrees Celsius. And then we are talking about a price range between 63 and 127 per ton CO2 equivalent. As you can see here, a lot more carbon taxes and ETS systems already fall between this price range. The EU ETS system, for example, does as well. As you can see here in Europe, these are the carbon taxes outside of the EU ETS. So as you can see, there is a large difference with the northern countries almost levying a carbon tax of 100 and 120 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent on sectors that do not fall under EU ETS right now. And as you can see, other countries like Belgium, for example, don't have a carbon tax yet, or it didn't in April 1st of 2024, or they have very low rates for carbon taxes. So as you can see, even for nations, even for governmental bodies, it is still a search for what a good carbon price is that should be levied towards its businesses. As you can see here, I've mentioned it before, the EU ETS is evolving. There are less allowances being sold in the market over time. So as less shares are available, the price will go up. We had a large price increase in 2021, 2022 because of the energy prices. This also fueled a bit this increase. But as less allowances are being sold, the price will go up. EU ETS 2 will have a separate price as well. This will also factor into the general carbon price being levied in Europe. And these can be really good indications of what internal carbon price you can use at your organization. If I recall correctly, right now it is around 75 to 80 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent. Now, If we want to calculate an internal carbon price, we need to ask ourselves the question, why should we set an internal carbon price? And there are three main reasons. As I started this presentation, you should use internal carbon price to build smarter business cases for sustainability. Now, this is a problem for, or is a challenge for every business unit. All business units generate costs and have budgets to circumvent these costs, but they need to build business cases to undermine, or not undermine, but build a reference as to what costs will be saved using this business case, or what revenue can be gained by investing in certain projects. Now you can use carbon price, or you can incorporate carbon price into net present value calculations and into internal rate of return, which are financial instruments used by the finance department to really see what the value is of certain investments. And this will make the costs of not investing in sustainability more tangible for your CFO and CEO. It's much more tangible for a business if you can say it will cost this amount of money, rather than it will just help with emissions reduction. No, this will eat at your bottom line, this will eat at your margins, and this is why it is important. That is why internal carbon pricing really serves as a vehicle for building business cases. The second one is carbon price serves as a key input for cost abatement curves. So what is the cost abatement curves? It shows the costs of certain sustainability investments, and it will show how much CO2 can be reduced with a certain initiative, as well as what the cost for the organization is. Certain cost savings will make it negative, the price of a cost abatement curve. Others will base it above 50 or 100 euros for certain projects, which do not generate cost savings or direct revenue. The second reason why you should set an internal carbon price is to anticipate changes. A business needs to be flexible, it needs to be prepared for the future, and we know in regulations, changes are coming. I already mentioned it before. We have EU ETS 2 coming towards road transport, towards smaller industrial installations, but other carbon market prices will increase, external carbon taxes will increase over the coming decades, which means the cost to your company will either be direct and increasing, or it will be indirect and decreasing, depending on how your supply chain looks like. And you also need to anticipate changes in supply chain pressures, because you might have two companies within the same industry, but depending on how their supply chain looks like, they will be more or less exposed to these price fluctuations in carbon pricing. The third one is to improve communication towards stakeholders by translating the carbon footprint of a company's activities into a financial cost that is easier for everyone to understand. I've given the example of supplier selection in the beginning of this presentation. You need to communicate towards your stakeholders when you are incorporating carbon costs, so they can take it into account. If you want to invest in certain technologies, if you want to invest in certain projects, this will help explain to your employees, for example, why they can't travel as much by airplane, for example, or why certain changes need to be made. It's much easier to understand it because of the costs, rather than just merely how much emissions are reduced with a certain project. Now, I want to show this graph merely to exemplify that internal carbon pricing is already being adopted by many organizations across the world. This was a survey in 2021 by the CDP, which checked which industries had ICP adoption. And as you can see, the power and fossil fuels industry had high degrees of ICP adoption. This is very logical. They are the ones who have to pay ETS, for example. They are directly linked to the carbon taxes, which are already in effect. They will also need to sell this price premium to their customers, so increase prices at the pump. So for them, an internal carbon price is a really important metric to assess. Investing in a biomass facility, how much will that cost? How much can we sell to customers, or how much can we transfer the cost down our supply chain? But if you look at the right side of the graph, manufacturing, only 30% of companies are working to implement ICP within 2 years. We are 2025, so these companies should already have internal carbon price mechanisms in place. Now, I want to give you some examples just to give you an idea. You are not alone if you want to start with internal carbon prices. A lot of companies across the globe are already implementing it. Unilever, for example, in 2021, decided to implement the shadow price for all CapEx investments over 1 million, which covers approximately 80% of their total capital investment. They did a scenario analysis and they assumed the carbon price of 245 US dollars per ton, which is much higher than most carbon taxes. And they used a carbon offsetting price of 65 US dollars per ton by 2050. So here you can see again how these price signals can differ for different companies depending on their exposure to certain taxes and the makeup of their supply chain. Elia, which is a Belgian company, so it's more closer to heart, also disclosed that they've raised their ICP from 55 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent to 200, almost a 4 times increase. They did this at the beginning of the year. They published a report about it. You see, even these large-scale organizations who are in energy are still trying to figure out what a proper price signal is for their carbon costs. If you then look at an example of implicit pricing, Carbfix is a company in Iceland that captured CO2 from a geothermal plant and injects it into underground basal rock. They can do this process for 25 per ton of CO2 stored. So this is the direct price of CO2 storage, but it is only applicable to like these types of projects. And then the last one is an internal carbon tax. Microsoft is a good example of this. So they have been using an internal carbon fee since 2012 to fund its carbon reduction and renewable energy initiatives. But it is really important, their initial carbon fee focused on scope 1, scope 2, and business air travel. So for a company that creates computers, that creates a lot of cloud hosting, and they don't account for other scope 3 categories, which might be very large for them, but they only do it for scope 1, 2, and business air travel. And the proceeds from the fee provided funding for their carbon neutral commitment and investments they made. When it started out, it was $15 per metric ton of CO2 equivalent. And now in 2022, they increased it to $100 per ton of CO2 equivalent. They have an actual tax, so they direct funds within the organization, whereas Unilever has a shadow pricing, which just uses to direct decisions around investments without actually charging prices within the organization. Now, how can you implement internal carbon pricing? It's a very straightforward process, but it is very dependent on how your business operates, how complex it is, the business units you are involved in. So you need to go through a couple of steps, but you need to work as any good sustainability officer or manager does, work together with different business units to get a grasp of what internal carbon pricing can apply to within your organization. The start is always calculate. You need to have a corporate carbon footprint calculation. You need to know scope 1 to 3. It's even better if you have product carbon footprint because then you can levy your internal carbon price towards your supply chain. So calculating your corporate carbon footprint, product carbon footprint is the basis. You also need to determine your reduction targets because depending on what your emissions are now and where you need to be in 2030 and 2050, there will be a certain cost of decarbonization linked to this amount. And you should also gather primary data because investments in scope 1 and 2, for example, projects, laying solar panels, changing cars to electric cars, you have a very good view of the costs. Whereas the costs related to your supply chain, you will need primary data for because you are lacking the PCF information for the products you are purchasing to make a good estimation of what your internal carbon price will be. The second part is determine scope. The term scope, you will have to identify the use case for an internal carbon price. You need to establish boundaries and determine the ICP type. And then we will move into set pricing and implementation. So as I mentioned before, you need to calculate first. You need to calculate your reduction targets. You can use SBTI. You can use a 4.2% baseline reduction year over year. These can be a first preliminary exercise to building the business case. And then you can gather primary data. So you can have improved data accuracy for your corporate carbon footprint, product carbon footprint, and you just need it for scope 3 business cases. And ClimateCamp does specialize in calculating and gathering this primary data for scope 3. The second part, determining scope, identifying use cases for internal carbon price is really important. Why is it important? Because, for example, certain organizations have different internal carbon prices. You could have a different internal carbon price for CapEx or mergers and acquisition analysis than you have for improving of operational expenses or R&D processes or how you evaluate suppliers. You could have a shadow price of $100 or 100 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent for CapEx investments, but have an internal carbon price of $15 or 15 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent for supplier evaluation. So the use case is always where you start when you want to implement internal carbon pricing. The second one is establishing the boundary. So will you only do it for scope 1, 2, 3, or like the different categories or some categories within 3? As we saw before, the Microsoft example, they only did it for 1, 2, and 3, but 3 business travel. You also need to establish an ICP boundary as it relates to an organizational unit. This seems straightforward because if you have an internal carbon price in Europe, it will be much more influenced by EU ETS, CBAM, these type of regulatory mechanisms for carbon taxes, than if your organizational unit in the US or in China or in Africa. So it is really important to establish an ICP boundary related to the external carbon prices in these different countries. And the third step is determine the ICP type. Will you work with a shadow price? Will you work with internal carbon tax? Or will you use implicit pricing to determine price signals for a shadow price or an internal carbon tax? The advice I would give, everybody starts out with shadow pricing and moves towards internal carbon taxes. You can also do like Microsoft and have an internal carbon tax limited to certain scopes. Now we move into the third part, which is the most difficult part, which is setting the prices. Now you need to choose a methodology, not only the type of internal carbon price, so not only will I use a shadow price or an internal charge, but you always need to think about the methodology as a static price or a dynamic price. What do I mean with that? You will make an indication of, for example, our ICP is, let's say, 100 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent, which may be much higher than ETS, but it is already taking into account that the price will go up. So for example, you say, oh, we take 100, whereas ETS is only 80, because we know it will go up in the coming years, and we want to simulate costs for projects over a 5-year time horizon, a 10-year time horizon. But you could also take a dynamic price. You could say, okay, we have an internal carbon price of, let's say, 50 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent, but then increase it with 10% every year. So these type of choices when it comes to methodology is really important before you actually choose a price signal. Otherwise, you might get into trouble because you might simulate costs which are totally not relevant within 5 to 10 years because of price increases. The second part is also the difference per region and per product. Internal carbon pricing, depending on which scopes you apply to, depending on which organizational units, you need to decide how limited it is and where it is applied to. And the first step, the easiest step for everybody, is consider external benchmarks. Use the ETS price, use carbon tax prices to give yourself a first price signal into determining your internal carbon pricing. We will have an example a bit later, which Laurent will go into, of a company that just takes the ETS price and uses that as their internal carbon pricing. So always start there, consider external benchmarks, but you could also look towards carbon prices from peers. For example, we have a lot of customers in the food manufacturing industry. I know for a fact that Ben & Jerry has levied a price of, I think, $10 per ton of CO2 equivalent, but for its supply chain. So not for its investments, not for other parts of its business. So also take a look at what carbon prices your peers are using to direct your own internal carbon pricing. And then if you don't just take over an external price or use that as a price signal for your internal carbon prices, you need to start simulating. You need to simulate a potential price using past investments, so the implicit pricing, the implicit carbon price, which I mentioned before. You need to evaluate the cost of sustainable purchases. Maybe you already have suppliers who have sustainable goods. You can ask them to see what is the difference in premium for purchasing sustainable goods and use that to simulate what the extra cost might be today to incorporate for carbon taxes or carbon costs. And you can do a marginal abatement cost curve. I've mentioned this before, where you outline different initiatives. I'll focus on it a bit here. Here you list all different initiatives based on how much CO2 they reduce or are going to reduce over the coming 5, 10, 20 years. And then you're going to estimate the amounts of costs, either positive or negative, that is associated with this implementation. So things can be negative because it will save you direct costs, which you can estimate in fuel costs, for example, for switching from fossil fuel-based cars towards electricity-based cars. And then you list all these next to each other to form a sort of decision matrix to see which type of sustainability solutions have what effect do they have and what is the impact on a financial level. This is a marginal cost abatement curve. Why is it marginal? Because it translates the cost of CO2 emissions reductions to 1 ton of CO2 emissions reduction. And it is a cost curve because, as you can see here, you list all the different initiatives from how costly they are from left to right. And then we go into the fourth part, implementation. So let's assume you just took over the EU ETS price as your internal carbon pricing. The work doesn't stop there. Embedding it in your organization is very critical to actually having people use the internal carbon price. So as I mentioned before, the Unilever example, if you want to embed carbon pricing in tendering, you need to have clear guidelines on how it will be used for supplier selection. It needs to be communicated, as I said before, and as listed here. It needs to be communicated internally and externally. We will use carbon price. We will use it to evaluate you as a supplier. This is the price or the price level we are using so that they can take it into account when they are making their price offering to you. You need to make rules. If you do an internal carbon tax or an internal carbon charge, you need to have rules for how you will levy this internal carbon tax and how you will distribute funds. Microsoft pools it in one general fund and then uses it for sustainability investments. You might limit it to business units or use it for the place where the CO2 emissions were generated. So the money that comes from business travel also needs to go to investments which are used to improve the emissions reduction in business travel. And you need to monitor, report, and adjust. This is a live mechanism. It is something that you need to evaluate year over year. As I said before, Elia hiked their internal carbon price from 50 to 200 euros. Obviously, they do this because of the changing regulations once EU ETS2 takes into effect, and we know the price for that market. Once CBAM takes into effect, once we start seeing these price increases down the supply chain, you might need to alter your internal carbon pricing. But try to keep it as simple as possible, because if you have 15 different internal carbon prices, or it is very complex as to how it will be applied, it will not be used in decision making at all. So try to keep it simple, try to have a test case with an organizational unit, with a certain part of your business, with a certain scope within your emissions, and then try to expand from there. Which brings me to my next part, and for this I will involve Laurent to talk a bit more about how you can use carbon pricing to improve supplier selection.
Yes, thank you very much, Maarten. It was a very comprehensive and understandable presentation about still a more complex topic, let's say. But thank you very much. Indeed, I will focus a bit more on a practical example on how to implement or how to use a carbon price as in a procurement department, for example. So here it really is about how a company sends out a tender to their suppliers and how they will calculate and take into account different options to purchase, to compare different products and to compare different suppliers to each other. So how is it built up indeed? So when we send out a tender, it's of course asking about the product price, and of course we also take into account in this exercise that the quality of the products is all equal. So we compare basically on the price of the product, and we calculate additionally on top of that the product carbon footprint multiplied with the carbon price, and in this example emission trading system or an internal carbon price that can be used, and that will together give the total cost or the total price for each product and help a procurement department to make a decision on which of the products they should buy based on the price. So here in the example product 1, you see that the initial price of the product was lower. It was 10. But the carbon footprint of the product was higher, meaning resulting in a higher total price. In product 2, initially the supplier came in with a higher price for the product, but they already invested a lot in decarbonizing that product, and they can offer a lower product carbon footprint, which results in a lower total price where the procurement department can compare the results. So initially you would have bought product 1, but in this case now, because they have sustainability targets and they need to decarbonize and also have specific scope 3 reduction targets, for example, it is more attentive to go for product 2, because there you can and have a lower total cost and decarbonize your scope 3 significantly. So that is what should be bought. I will give 2 more very concrete examples about this. The first one is Halion. Halion is a large company in health consumer products. And actually, it's been in January 2025 that I joined the Scope 3 peer group in London, where together with the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, so these are 2 organizations that are focusing on these examples of use cases to implement in companies. They have working groups where they together figure out how to do this and how to implement this. And Halion is one of the first that presented their case, because they actually went to their suppliers with a tender with asking for product carbon footprint and telling them that they will take it into account in their buying decision. So it was actually Chris Lowe of Halion there that presented the case. He's the procurement professional of Halion. So what they did is they did the same. So they say to their suppliers, okay, give me your standard product price, but also the product carbon footprint. And they let them know that they will calculate based on the ETS price that was then fixed in the tender. They will take this price to calculate the carbon cost of each product, which gave them the total bid or the total price that they can compare different products with. This resulted in a scoring system where they have a low carbon supplier that can come in with actually a higher product price because they did previously the investments to decarbonize, and where other competitors, other suppliers, initially, actually, because they know they have not a good product carbon footprint data, that they need to come in at an initial very low price to compensate that if they still want to win the bid. There's one more thing. In many cases, the supplier will not yet have the product carbon footprint data available. And to counter that, the risk that so what will happen if the product carbon footprint data is not available from the supplier, then there will be taken into account the industry average emission factors that are available in public databases. But to make sure that the industry average emission factor is never better than a primary data point, a product carbon footprint delivered by a supplier, they actually increase on purpose. And they tell also the supplier that if you can't share the data, we will use this data point, but increase it with 50% to always make sure that the companies that didn't do the product carbon footprint exercise are penalized compared to the suppliers that did do the product carbon footprint exercise. But usually the industry average emission factor is always, or we see that in the market, it's often and mostly always higher than a primary product carbon footprint calculated by the supplier themselves. The second example is a more calculated based on numbers. Example, it's not from a specific company, but here we see, for example, in the same purpose, if a company wants to buy, let's say, packaging, a cardboard box, then they have two suppliers to compare. Supplier A comes in with a price per box at 40 cents, but they have a high carbon footprint of 1 kilogram CO2 equivalent per box. Supplier B, they come in at initially a higher price, only 43 cents, so 3 cents higher than the conventional product, let's say, but it's a more sustainable product. They have half of the product carbon footprint per box. If we just take into account the price per box for, let's say, 2 million boxes, then we have, and I think it's 5 million boxes that I counted. So we have a total purchase cost of 2 million versus 2.15 million, meaning supplier A is obviously cheaper and is probably the option that the procurement department will choose for. If we now take into account the carbon price of, let's say, 100 euro per ton CO2 equivalent, that means that for the 1 kilogram per box for supplier A, we come at a total cost of 500,000 euro additionally. And for supplier B, we only come to 250,000 euro additionally on top of the initial purchase cost. Meaning that now in this example, we see that actually supplier B becomes the cheaper option and the more attractive for procurement to choose for. But that's not the only thing that we do, because indeed we will calculate what does it now cost for each ton of emissions, CO2 equivalent, to pay actually more, but reduce also more emissions. So in this example, we actually compare supplier A and supplier B based on the difference in cost initially, the 150,000 euro that additional spend, and the 2,500 tons of emissions totally that are actually saved if we would choose for supplier B. Based on this calculation, we see that actually the cost per ton CO2 that we reduce or avoid in this case, if we move from supplier A to supplier B, it will be reduced, that we have a 60 euro per ton CO2 equivalent cost to reduce those 2,500 tons of emissions, meaning 60 euro per ton emissions reduced is cheaper than the initially aimed 100 euro per ton that carbon price that we accounted for, meaning that today going for this option is cheaper than for what we actually predict that the cost of reducing the emissions would be. So in this case, it's actually a no-brainer for a sustainability department and a procurement department to choose for supplier B and based on this carbon price of 100 euro.
Okay, thank you very much, Laurent, for giving these examples. Obviously, this example has like very large differences between the carbon cost, the product carbon footprint, just to exemplify how this decision can be made. In reality, these PCFs will be much closer together, maybe, and the cost might also be much closer together. But then it becomes a way of communicating with your suppliers, as mentioned before. If we communicate carbon cost will be taken into account, this is the internal carbon pricing mechanism, then companies that have either two choices to become or to stay a preferred supplier, either they need to have cheaper goods or they need to sell it at cheaper costs towards their customer, or they need to invest in emissions reduction. So this incentivizes down your supply chain to make a choice for one of the two. And if they just do a race to the bottom in price, they will not be financially viable after 5 to 10 to 20 years. Then we'll move on to the final slide of this presentation, and something I really want to focus on. We are not carbon pricing consultants. We do not specialize in placing carbon pricing within organizations, but our platform helps you gather the primary carbon data, especially for supply chain. As we mentioned before, this primary data from for procurement, for example, to PCFs and to make these decisions. And we help you calculate corporate carbon footprint, scope 1, 2, 3, product carbon footprint, as well as reduction targets, let's say SBTI or similar. And these are necessary to support this financial-driven business cases for sustainability. And you should keep in mind CEOs, CFOs, people who make the final decisions on will we invest in this, will we choose certain goods, or will we prioritize certain decisions. It will always help to have a more financially driven business case than merely an environmental one, unfortunately. I really want to thank Laurent for sharing his input on the Halion case and as well on the numbers example. And then I want to move towards the Q&A and see if there are people who have specific questions when it comes to carbon pricing. Let's see.
So far, there are 2 questions in the Q&A.
Okay, so we have Ruben Pepe, is monetary emission factor also fit when a PCF is mission? Thus, total emissions divided by the annual turnover of the supplier. Yes, so the intensity or so we can use pen-based to account for this, let's say, corporate carbon footprint. We take the supplier and then we divide it according to the costs. But when a PCF is missing, that is a way you can apply it as well. But you should always incentivize your suppliers to come up with PCFs and not have just a relative footprint based on their corporate carbon footprint, because many, unless they have only a set amount, a limited amount of products, this will always be it will not be accurate. It will not be a very accurate metric to evaluate your supplier.
Yes, and what's also important there is, of course, that you use the same formula or the same way to compare it actually for different products, different suppliers. You need to use the same methodology to compare it. So if for one supplier you have an accurate primary product carbon footprint, for the other one, you use this intensity calculation based on spend-based, then you will have very different results, which are difficult to compare. So then the suggestion would be to still, if possible, use an emission factor which is based on the same unit per product as the initial primary data of the other supplier, the product carbon footprint is, and that helps to compare it better. Yeah.
Okay. I'll then also move on to the second question, which I will have to answer that I don't know. Do you know how Microsoft did collect the carbon free from their local entities without being hurt with official country taxes? As far as my research showed, they haven't communicated how their internal fund allocation works. My estimation would be that it can be directed still at all sustainability.
It looks like the connection of Maarten dropped. Maarten, do you still hear us?
Okay, I quickly left the meeting, but there is one final question. How do you ensure a common methodology and product carbon footprint calculation to ensure a level playing field from your suppliers? Well, this is a very good question. So cradle to gate, which type of methodology are you using for product carbon footprint calculation? As mentioned before, people are just moving into product carbon footprint calculations and sharing that with their customers. I think the Halion example showed that just applying a PCF and probably a validated PCF will probably be the case. Will be the minimum requirement. Maybe over time they will require certain methodology, outline certain rules when doing product carbon footprint calculation. But as we can see with Halion, they just go like you either have PCF or you don't, and you get penalized if you don't. But placing restrictions or like having guidelines for the PCF would, I think, also be a very logical next step in requesting PCFs from your suppliers. So they have a certain methodology they have to use, a certain boundary which they have to apply.
Yes, so in the Halion case, actually, they received the same question during their presentation in January, and they spent a lot of time and energy in validating the product carbon footprint that they receive from their suppliers, meaning they also want to streamline that as much as possible. We are looking intensively to the Pact Pathfinder framework, for example, which is a protocol that defines how product carbon footprint needs to be calculated, how it can be exchanged between customers and suppliers and their solution providers, and how the product carbon footprint can be validated to make sure that you indeed have a level playing field. So today, the reality is that many procurement teams are spending a lot of time and energy in not only collecting those data points, but also validating and understanding those data points of product carbon footprint to make sure that they have a level playing field. So it's a very fair question, Joris.
Okay, and then Joris asked an additional question, which I will answer, and then we will start to close the webinar. But you said, do you take operational costs next to purchase cost into account, total cost of goods? In your cases, it seems you don't. I mean, for example, if you purchase a pump, there's also the electrical consumption during operating for the pump, for example. Yes, so we take a simple example, because if you actually, and this is something I want to stress with internal carbon pricing in general, doing this exercise is not just a 3-step Excel formula to calculate certain costs. You should take into account capital goods versus actual purchase goods, for example. How will usage be different? For capital goods, for example, is operational costs which are linked to the purchase of a certain capital good. Will we take that into account? This is much more complex and is very reliant on, as we said before, the goods you purchase and how they are sold. If you are a distributor, it is a totally different ballgame than when you actually buy capital goods which are used in manufacturing. For example, I would, as much as possible, try to create a holistic view on the costs, so operational costs next to purchase cost, and take those into account. But it is very dependent on the goods you produce, source, and the type of business you are. And on that note, I would like to thank everybody for joining us. This is the first time we talked about carbon pricing. It's still very new in the market, and we are really invested in helping sustainability teams as well build business cases for these investments, sustainable purchasing, sustainable procurement. As we mentioned before, we're specialized in calculation as well as primary data collection. So if you're interested in that, you can always reach out to us.